There comes a time in every poker player's career where the best thing for their game is just to get a big old leak buster session done on them. And that's what we're going to do today. We're going to go into some of the hands where Mark has VPIP'd, meaning he has played them in the first place and he's seen the flop as well. We have no filters on here whatsoever. So this is like going into the wild and seeing what Mark has actually done and seeing what leaks we can unearth. Are you nervous about this process, Mark? Things have been going better in this series. Do we expect a continuation of that today?
No, I'm ready to get the shit kicked out of me.
You think you're going to get the shit kicked out of you? I hope so too, because there's nothing I like more on a Friday morning than getting rid of some frustration. Okay, let's jump right in. Ace 3 of spades in the small blind. We open. Big blind calls. Queen 10 deuce. Your thoughts? Let's make this rapid fire like a quiz show. Let's go.
I would be range betting for a small size on a monotone board like this.
Is that exploitative or theoretical?
I think it's probably theoretical.
Using a small size is theoretical. Range betting is not on a monotone board, because when a board is high like this in rainbow, it's going to be good for your range. But remember, the monotone is like the police. It kind of neutralizes all of the fun, stops either player from really having a big advantage. And betting all of your range here is exploitative if you do this, like you are deviating from GTO. Remember, just because you're betting small, it doesn't mean you're betting range. There's lots of spots where, and again, I would refer you back to same one I referenced last week, actually, grade 1 lecture 8, which is about float betting the flop and devising a strategy. Although this is a c-bet, not a float bet. Float bet's when you're checked to by the razor. The same thing still applies, where you want to think about a sizing and you want to think about a frequency, right? Actually, no, this is lecture 6 more than lecture 8, just for your reference. Range advantage, range disadvantage, that sort of stuff. So here, because you don't have a big range advantage, you would use a mediocre bet frequency, a reasonable one, maybe 60%, and you would use a small size because you don't have a nut advantage that's large either. So you're just kind of computing both of those factors. And I would say your c-bet game, like, you're probably not making big mistakes on the flop with your c-bet game, but nevertheless, we could tidy up your c-bet game a bit and just say, do I have a big enough range advantage to range bet? If not, let's pick a rough global frequency, and then let me compare my hand to my global frequency, right? It's a bit harder to do, but it's well worth it in the long term. It just makes you a more well-rounded, honed poker player. So I think with ace 3, my idea here would be with the backdoor straight draws, not that much showdown value and overcard. I can definitely bet this hand. I can probably bet it close to my global frequency. So I would just mix bet and check here. But I tell you what, if I was against a random fish, I would just bet, because I don't like facing random stabs all the time from those players.
Yeah, I checked then. That just shows how, let's say, loose my flop play is. My thought process didn't align with what I did, so...
No,
yeah.
But I don't think you really have a protocol on the flop. I've noticed this before. It is quite sloppy. And the way to fix that is just to say, what's my global strategy? Am I bet? Even for now, simplify it. Like, say I'm either range betting, range checking, which will be very rare as a pre-flop raiser, but it can happen, or I'm mixing. And if you're mixing, just try to estimate, am I betting the flop at a low frequency, which could be like 25%, a medium frequency, which could be 50%, and a high frequency, which could be 75%, and then compare your hand and its polarization and how much it wants to bet to that, and pick a rough frequency and go from there. Although, I will stipulate that if you're against a weaker player, you do want to be more aggressive with your air and less aggressive with your good hands. You want to be giving more rope because they are betting a bit too often when checked to in these spots, and also c-betting a bit weaker with your semi-trash hands like this one, because you don't really want to face that overzealous stab that's coming your way pretty frequently. Make sense?
Yeah, makes sense.
Cool. So check, bet, obviously now we have to fold, but because they do just like to bet a lot when checked to, and for good reason. Villain is doing the right thing against you by betting randomly here. If Villain is besting you here with the king 8 of clubs and be like, aha, he's overfolding, he's probably right, and he's probably getting you. So I know how much you hate to be got, so just be careful about that, because Pool is stabbing aggressively here, and you need to protect this checking range and make sure that that involves checking good hands a lot, but it also involves betting bad hands too, so that they're not flooding, surging into the checking range, yeah? So that's point one. You're from a leak buster. It's common that the student goes away with like 20 different things to sort of think about. It can be quite overwhelming. So definitely after this session, go back and watch the video again when it comes out on YouTube and just basically take some notes and things. Yeah, maybe write up a summary. Okay, easy call. Check. We check back. What's your float bet strategy here? So again, let's make today a very technical class. What would be your sizing if you were to start betting? And what I'll do here, just for the clarity, is remove your cards. What sizing will your range use if it bets here, and why? Then we can come to your hand once you've defined that. So have a think about it. Would you use small bets or would you use big bets here, and why?
I think I'd use big bets here, because the hands that I'd be stabbing with, it depends. Like, are we talking theoretically here or exploitatively? Because I think exploitatively, the checking range here is from Villain is very weak, so I'm over stabbing.
Fine. But
And
why
I'm
a big bet?
overstabbing probably with a small size because I think they're inelastic in terms of their folding range.
Okay, so they probably are a little bit inelastic. I'm not sure this is a spot where they're like massively inelastic, but I don't hate the thought of switching to a small bet because you think they're less elastic, less sensitive to sizing than they should be. Like, I think that makes some sense, but then it would make sense to go fully exploitative and actually big bet your good hands and small bet your bluffs. That would be like the max exploit strategy if that were the case. Theoretically, though, you could elaborate. I think you're almost there, but maybe you can elaborate a bit more on why theoretically your range would prefer a big sizing here.
I think because I'm polarizing my range in theory here, I think I'm betting, and a lot of my value hands will want to build a pot, I think. So if I have King X here, I have Queen X, I think a lot of that just wants to build a pot against the range that checks.
Yeah, I think that's pretty reasonable. Like, you're going to be betting a strong value range. I don't know about like betting a ton of your Queen X, but certainly betting with King X plus, it's not like you're going to want to build bets necessarily with like pocket 8s or 4 or 5 or something here anyway. So I think on these high boards, the trick really is just using a bigger sizing and doing it with quite a polarized strategy that involves betting a strong value hand or a bluff, basically. So yeah, that makes sense. So let's turn our cards back on. I only do this when I'm doing like very vague range construction, by the way. I wouldn't normally like hide the cards, but that's the purpose. Queen of Hearts comes on the turn. It goes check, and we check again. So maybe we just touch on this hand. Is there a reason to bet ace 9 here? Are you always checking this one on the flop?
On the flop, I think I'm always checking.
And why?
I think I have enough in my polarized range in terms of my non-made hands. I will be using a lot of 2 clubs hands and straight draws. So like gut shots, open enders and the likes. And I think that's enough bluffs. I don't need to go down. And I think I have maybe some showdown value with the ace that if I start betting, that would destroy the showdown element of my EV. So
yeah, I like that idea that when we bet a hand that has showdown value, we in some sense destroy its ability to win at showdown because we force our opponent to continue a bit wider. I think if you had a hand like ace 5 with the ace of clubs, that would be a bit different. Like, you would have the better nutted backdoor with a bit more value element to the bet for that reason, for that coming in. And you would also have less showdown value with ace 5 instead of ace 9, and that would be a bit more reasonable to start betting. But ace 9, I think, is a pretty reasonable hand just to check with here, but having a club compared to not having a club is also another factor that would sway you a little bit towards betting sometimes. But yeah, I think pure check here is good. What happens to your showdown value on this card?
I think my showdown value goes up.
So it's a dry card. It could have been a jack, a 10, an 8, a 7, a club. It could have been stuff that reduced your showdown value, but in fact it was a card that made the board even harder to connect with. The harder the board is to connect with, to use the Carrot Poker School language, the closer it is to a still lake instead of a tsunami. And Choppy Sea is kind of in the middle. If you recall, we have these like 3 metaphorical classifications of how easy to hit or hard to connect with the board is. This one is quite still. There's not a lot of ripples in the ocean here, and ace 9 is therefore kind of still preserved. It's still quite a good hand. So we check. The Jack of Clubs comes on the river. Villain bets for half pot. Let's hear your thought process here.
My thought process is that I need to win half pot bet 25% of the time. I think enough of the time here, he will have a jack, but enough of the time I will have a call against just his air stabs. I think I've easily 25% of the time I will win here with ace high.
Yeah, so if villain is constructing properly and like slow playing enough here, then that wouldn't be the case. But I think people are quite bad at that. I think people are very bad at constructing in a way where they have enough flushes here, or enough trips here, or enough top pair here. Essentially, I think top pair is bet either on the flop or the turn way too frequently. I think a queen is bet either on the flop or the turn way too frequently. I think a flush, it's the same thing. And therefore, I think that this spot is very overbluffed just based on how humans think about the game here. Does that mean that you can start calling a hand like this? Yes, I think so. I think you've done a good job here. The other option is raise. You do have a club blocker. You would have some flushes here that you'd want to raise with. I wonder if we're worried that our opponent might be a bit merged here, like might be like a weaker player that's got a lot of jack X that they maybe shouldn't be betting for this size but are, or we think our opponent has like pocket 6s or some weird shit like that. Sometimes we might actually favor raise here. So I just want to like put that on your radar that like raising the spot's not ridiculous with this hand either, with the 9 of clubs blocker and those worries maybe against some weaker players.
Oh, you'll see what I actually fold here, I think. And I do think that's a mistake.
I mean, it is triple Broadway, but at the same time, especially when we have a club blocker, I think we should be doing something to exploit the fact that pool is very bad at waiting with trips, top pair, or flushes here. or even straight draws. Therefore, I'm kind of drawn to raise in this spot, quite honestly, because I think you'll run into like some weaker players with some bizarre hands that you actually like call against here and lose to. I think call is probably plus EV, but I wonder if raise might be better. I do think you want to attack, check, check, bet quite a lot. I think it's a line that's very, very underprotected. Check, big bet. Your thoughts?
I think facing a big bet, I have a fold.
Yeah, I would agree. I think even with the deuce of spades, this is probably still a spot where our hand is just abysmal. There's 3 over cards. We don't really have, I mean, we have some like backdoor straight draw, but I think large bets, the other problem with them is that theoretically there's meant to be a lot of like jack 9 of clubs in this line. And I think that humans...
It'll keep barreling then, will it? Like, we can't face any more aggression on the turn or river here with a pair of 2s.
Sure, but like GTO knows that. It's still calling a hand like pocket 5, pocket 7s here, maybe 5s here, even though that's the case. So it's not the case that just because you'd be folding on a blank turn, you can't call the flop. We want to make sure we don't go too overboard with that thought process. What I was really getting at though is that if villain is supposed to bet a lot with jack 9 of clubs on the flop, and they're not doing that in reality, because I think humans suffer from another Carrot Poker School term, the comfort blanket fallacy, which is where they feel like they have to have a flush draw, straight draw, something to make a big bluff here, to make a big bet bluff. Then I think this spot can get under bluffed very easily for the large sizing, and I would be inclined to overfold. I think a spot like this came up in the 3rd episode of From Losing to Cruising as well. So I like fold here right off the bat. Good, excellent stuff. Just exploiting the fact that they're probably not going to bet wide enough there with their low EV bluff portion. Guys, watching a Carrot Poker School training video is like getting an elite academic education in cash game poker that you simply cannot get anywhere else. If studying poker was like studying, say, law for instance, then choosing the Carrot Poker School would be like getting into the top law school in the country. Imagine getting 33 lectures from such an establishment for less than £1,000. Most poker players struggle because they simply lack the theory necessary to understand the mechanics of this complex game properly. They get disorganized, random content and rely on the advice of peers in study groups and forums who are also struggling. The Carrot Poker School gives you all of the material you need to achieve your wildest poker dreams. The rest is up to you. To pick up the Carrot Poker School today, click the top link in the description, head on over to carrotcorner.com, add it to your cart, go to checkout, make a payment, and you are done within 10 seconds. You can then download all of our videos and get ready to start your full scholarship. Let's get back to the action. Okay, ace-7 of hearts in a cutoff, open, and a call. Ace-10-4, we check, villain bets. Pure calling here, easy.
Pure call.
Deuce of hearts turn, check, check, and the 7. I think 2 pair on the river. So let's hear your thoughts on this spot. This is quite interesting.
My thoughts here are that they don't have too many flushes on this node, having checked behind on the turn. So I would expect pool to have a low amount of made flushes here. So I think my hand has high equity on this card, and I would be betting for a large sizing. With my made, I will have made flushes on this node. Obviously I have this hand, but I think I have a range advantage on this card.
Okay, so I don't like the way that you throw range advantage around. Range advantage should be used to determine who has more EV in the spot, and that should be used to determine like how selectively you can bluff, like whether you can bluff, what the average EV of your bluffs is, how often your range will be betting an earlier street, like something like that, like a flop or something. I think throwing it in randomly is kind of chaotic and it basically causes you to maybe fall into the trap of going range advantage, therefore bet, which is nonsense. It's a nonsense thought process, right? So we don't want the link between your range advantage and your action to be that direct. We want it to be much more indirect and a bit more vague than that, right? It's a general feel thing. You're right though, we do have a range advantage in a major way in any spot where we call and then the turn goes check check, especially when the river is to do with the flop. You know what I mean by that? So this card is very related to the flop. You move towards having stuff that was related to the flop when you didn't fold the flop to villain's bet, therefore your range kind of likes this card quite a lot on this node. What that means is we want to bluff every time here when we have air. That's where range advantage would be really important to pick up on. If you had a hand like, let's say, Queen Jack of clubs here, it'd be very important that you bluffed because your range is kind of killing it and you have nothing and your fold equity is theoretically very high. So that's what we would call like a mandatory bluffing spot if you had that hand. Given that you have a 7 of hearts here, you're value betting and your job is to figure out First off, is it mandatory to value bet or is it just optional? That's one theoretical point I would consider. And secondly, what sizing is your hand good enough for? I agree with you that your hand is good enough to make a big bet, but not an overbet on this node. So to bet 75% pot, but not overbet. In reality, villain may be more capped with flushes than they should be. I'm not sure that makes overbet the best idea even so. Let's talk about how mandatory it is. There are 3 types of value bet, remember. Optional, mandatory, and prohibited. Clearly this isn't prohibited, like you could probably value bet here, but is this mandatory or is checking an option here? What do you think?
I think it's mandatory because the villain is going to check behind, I think, a lot. I think urgency is high with this type of hand. Maybe not in GTO, with them checking behind an appropriate amount of diamonds on the turn, but in my pool, I think they're more capped than in GTO. And so I think betting is mandatory. I think they're checking behind.
Yeah, I'm not really sure how much diamonds they have, how many flushes they have affects that, because you lose to a flush, right? So if they add more flushes, you're kind of saying they don't have enough flushes, therefore I have to bet. I mean, if you check, you're losing money to a flush anyway, right? It's not like you're check folding or something. So I think it's more to do with how polarized / condensed their range is. So if you think they have, so let me give you an exploitative puzzle to solve. I do think that this would be optional in GTO. I think that you block a pair of 7s, which is a bluff catcher. You block an ace, which is a bluff catcher. You unblock air very heavily. So I think slow playing a hand like this that unblocks air a lot is okay in GTO. It's probably just a mixed action between bet and slow play. If you had a hand like ace jack, I'd always bet because I'd be blocking bluffs with the jack dangling card. And I wouldn't actually be as worried about blocking calls. I don't have 2 pair, right? So I'd be happy to bet ace jack pure here. Ace 7, I think there would be some slow play, similar with things like 10-7 and stuff like that. What would you do? How would you deviate from this equilibrium plan of it being an optional value bet, of being a mixed action between bet and check? How would you deviate from that against, firstly, a villain whom you knew to be basically just betting way too many of their ace-x on the turn, being really merged and just having a super air heavy range, right? Someone that you just thought had a ton of air here and was quite aggressive. How would you deviate against them? And then how would you deviate against someone that just looked like a very placid weaker player, like a very passive fish?
I'd pure check against the first and I'd pure bet against the second.
Right, so I think that's what this comes down to more than anything. I think that's the biggest thing that's going to swing your EV in a spot such as this. So yeah, I totally agree. So we go for the big bet here, which I think is fine against many people. But I would also consider check. I think you're way too close to the camp of this being a pure bet, when actually I think theoretically it's very break even, and there will be players in the pool against whom it's actually better to check because they're just like way too air heavy and weak here. I think when you're out of position on the river, you need to remember the old sort of rule that when you're out of position, it's rarely mandatory unless you have certain blockers that maybe like block villains bluffing range or something like that. As long as you unblock bluffs, it should be viable to go for a check call or check raise here depending on villain sizing. And you unblock bluffs very heavily with this hand. Okay, let's move on to pocket 6s. And I'll give you a summary at the end of this session, just sort of saying where I think the main leaks are that we can bust here. Okay, so we cold call here against under the gun, which I think is fine. Villain checks and we check. Are you playing big bets or small bets here, and why? Same question I asked you earlier.
I'm playing big bets here. I sometimes have 9s. I won't always 3-bet 9s. It'll depend on the player. I don't have jacks. I have some jack X that will want to bet, and I'll have, as bluffs, I'll have hearts and some draws, straight draws. So I'll be selective with a larger sizing.
Yeah, okay. I was just going to say, you don't really need to think about your bluffing range when you're picking your sizing. Your bluffs are kind of willing to go either size. What matters is how you're constructing your value betting region. So like getting into bluffs there, it's not something you actually have to talk about when you're thinking about sizing. That's kind of a common fallacy. People are like, oh, bluff big because I get more fold equity, but it's like, yeah, but you pay more for it. You know, it's kind of a trade-off. So yeah, I think if you're value betting just Jack X plus, it makes sense to use a big bet here. One thing I would maybe add is if this 9 was like a lower card, like a 5, I might be using small bets because I might be more inclined to bet a bit more of my pocket pair region, right? Like my 8s, 9s, 10s, that kind of thing. I think with the 9 being out, or if this was a 10, I'd certainly move more towards bigger bets. I think that's fine. Another thing we might want to say though is that in theory, villains should be checking a lot of overpair here as well as other stuff, and that will kind of always hand them their nut advantage, and therefore there's nothing wrong with using small bets on low boards here. The jack is ambiguous, I get it, but if the board is like 8-6-3, I'd probably just use small bets because I need to understand that I'm betting a lot of medium pairs and my opponent's slow playing a lot of overpair, so I don't really have a big region, a dense region of my range that wants to like build a massive pot. Okay, so we check back 6s, we check back again, seems good. And we check river. Yeah, I think value is extremely thin here. While you will win almost always, I don't think you can value bet because villain just has a lot of stuff like this that's just never calling and then has to hero call. Ace, queen, ace, king combos probably a higher frequency than they're going to be able to do. So I like this hand. I think this is just normal. 3-betting queen, jack. So this is interesting. Again, I think your flop game, okay, you're against the short stack here, but I've seen you range bet these flops before.
Yeah.
So do you want to talk a little bit about why you checked here? I'm not saying it's bad, but I'm just curious as to why you deviated from your normal game plan here.
I checked because I just had second pair and I thought he's calling a lot of ace-x. There's a lot of ace-x in the call 3-bet range. The SPR is low, so I felt I didn't have to range bet. The upside wasn't there to range bet. That was my thinking.
Well, first off, why would it be the case, theoretically, that we're actually able to bet a hand like this? Why theoretically are we able to bet a hand like second pair, like at normal stack depth? Well, the idea is that you're not actually making a big pot. You're not polarizing massively here. You're not shoveling in 3 bets or something. If you have queen jack here against a reg with 100 bigs and you bet third pot, you do get called by some hands you're doing okay against. You do get folds that are semi-useful to you that clean up a little bit of equity, and you're only investing a little bit of money. So as long as you start checking after that, it's not really a big deal. But I agree with you that when the stack is short like this, like going for a bet, it's going to open villain up to just like jamming on you sometimes. Like short stack players can be quite volatile. They're going to do stuff like this. So I really like it. I like just playing the hand in a vacuum against a weaker player, just being like, okay, let's start with a check. Let's see what they do. And let's just play our hand as a mediocre hand. I think that's totally fine, like at this SPR. Villain jams, your thoughts?
Villain jams, this is obviously a weaker player with a short stack. And my thoughts here, I need to be good 39%, is that what it says? 37%, that wouldn't have been my thought in game.
Yeah, well, 2x pot is 40%, that's the milestone.
This is an overbet of the pot. I think, yeah, there's a lot of ace-x here, but there's also a lot of, I think there's air in a fish's range. I think there's an amount of air in this range as well. I can't remember what I did here, but I think given the short stack, I think I would be inclined to call.
Okay, so if this was for pot or less, I would completely agree that there's some air here. There's like some gutters and stuff like that. I'm assuming by air you mean like king, queen, king 10, queen 10. Hands like this that are drawn quite thin, sure. But against 2x pot, you're just, I just don't think you're going to see random hands like that very often. Normally when someone jams in this spot for everything, it's because they've hit something that takes them over a certain comfort threshold for making this jam. So to hand read effectively against these weak players in your pool, you need to kind of get inside their head to the right level of specificity. Not get inside their head as in like I'm being psychic and I'm saying that he thinks that I think that he thinks and it's all metagame and you're giving him really precise thoughts. Like I think that's too far. But probably giving villain some kind of, giving the pool of villains, I should say, some kind of general sort of mental state like when they're doing this. And usually it's just that they have something that they're committing their stack with now because there's a SPR pressure and they're short and they're fairly pot committed feeling and stuff like that. So usually what you're going to see here is a shit ton of ace-x, like an absolute ton of it. You're going to see some flush draws. You're maybe going to see a few gutters, but I think the amount of the time you see like 6s or 5s or king queen here is actually really low for this sizing. And against pool, this is a fold. This is absolutely a fold. Like, there's no way this is a call for this sizing. But if this is like SBR 1 and he only has 20 left, well, now it's extremely volatile. But I think at 2x pot is nowhere near that volatile. And I would fold this hand.
I think I did.
Yeah. So I'm a bit concerned by the inconsistencies of your thought process here. Like when you say air, I feel like it's extremely vague. Like I don't think you're engaging enough with what the player's range actually is. Again, like I said to you last week, I think hand reading is the key. And I know I promised the viewers a hand reading special, but I want the viewers to understand there's not been a gap between us recording episode 5 and episode 6 of From Losing to Cruising. So in episode 7, which will come out a week from now, we will do a hand reading special and I will get you to come with some prepared hands in which you're really trying to practice your hand reading skill. Do you remember in like, I think it was episode 2 or something, we faced such an overbet from a fish at a low SBR and you said, well, it's obviously very polar. And I objected to that because fish in this spot, they're actually very merged. They're very merged. You're going to see ace 10 here. That's the thing to understand. So there's a huge difference between you having like ace queen and you having queen jack. A huge difference. It shouldn't be maybe in theory, but there is, because what tips them over the edge for jamming 2x spot here is comfort. It's having a top pair hand. It's having a pair on the board. It's having a flush draw. It's an incredibly merged action. even though it looks like it should be a really polar one. I think that's the pattern that matters here.
Good.
But you did fold. But don't be so vague. When you're in these situations, engage with a specific line. Villain went 2x pot, engage with the player type, and try to think about the range distribution. Don't just be like, oh, there's lots of air I call. That's way too vague. Getting your specificity of your thought process right, that's such an important point. Let's do one more hand, then we're going to wrap it up for today's episode. Sometimes in these leak busters, we go through a lot of hands quickly. This 3-bet's good as long as villain doesn't appear to be a maniac. This 3-bet's fine. Range betting this flop, I think. Okay, let's talk about this hand. We'll make this our last one. What do you think?
I think the ace is very good for my range, but I am when he calls me on the flop, I'm polarizing my range on the turn, so I'm not range betting in this spot. So, and I think this fits into, I have 0 showdown value. The only way I can win this pot is to bet it, is to bluff with it. So I think this is a clear bluff, and I have outs to likely the better best. He doesn't have many 3x. Neither of us have much 3x. So I think I'm drawing to a good hand. He may have better clubs, but I think this is a clear barrel.
Yeah, so I mean, the other way we can win is if it goes check, check, and we bluff the river. So there is another way that we can win the pot. Also, it depends. Like, you don't want to bluff every single spot when just because it's your only way of winning. Here, you have so much equity to go with your hand, and your hand is rather frail. So if you check, it's kind of difficult to continue properly against large bets. And I do think this is probably like a pure bluff or very close to a pure bluff in theory. I agree with you. And I would always bet here. But I do wonder if, like, on some other board, you might be misapplying that where you can actually check jam the turn with your bluffs and it's totally fine with semi-bluffs, or where you just have nothing and you can check give up turn and then bluff river. So the reason that we have to bet turn here is the combination of the hand's prosperity and its frailness, meaning it can't continue very well if we check. That's the frailness. And then it's prosperous because it has way too much equity to ever want to check fold. So I think definitely I'm betting here. I don't like check raise here against pool. I think it's a pretty gross line to take. I don't love it at all with this bad of a flush draw. And I think we should just probably be betting. And sizing wise, you could be 60. I think it's totally fine. B50, B60. Yeah, you can do this too. Remember, the bigger you go, the more you sort of trigger your opponent to like jam something on you sometimes. Like if they do have ace king here or they do have ace queen, you're gonna like start to cause them to like jam sometimes, which is not great. So I maybe go a bit smaller than this, but I like it, and I like the fact you're identifying it as a mandatory bluff. So let's summarize. I think you need to sort out your flop game. I think you need to work on hand reading. These are the two things that have really emerged from this leak buster. I'm going to leave you to work on the flop protocol on your own. I don't want to do another session on that because it's not as important to EV. Next week, it's all about hand reading. Come prepared with some tagged hands, and I'm going to get you to go through what you think villain's range looks like and how you're going to exploit it. And we're going to do a really exploitative session in the 7th installment of From Losing to Cruising. Any summaries or thoughts today from you, Mark?
No, listen, that was really helpful. It's good to get some new things, but a lot of the themes are coming up again and again. So, I mean, my flop game is a little loose. So thanks for that. Enjoyed it.
Good session. Leak busters are important. We'll throw them in every now and then, and we'll see you guys in the next episode. Do leave us your comments. Do remember to subscribe to the channel. Do remember to like the video if you're enjoying this series. We'll see you next time. Bye for now.